The Lives of the Saints by the Reverend Alban Butler, taken from the 4th edition, published in 1954. August 25th. Saint Louis, King of France. This great king was son of Louis VIII, and was 8 years old when the death of his grandfather, Philip II, surnamed Augustus, put his father, who was then in the 36th year of his age, in possession of the crown of France in 1223. The saint was born at Poissy, in the diocese of Chartres, on the 25th of April, 1215, and because he had been there raised to the dignity of a Christian by the grace of baptism, he afterwards honored this place above others, to show how much he esteemed this spiritual dignity above that of his temporal crown. He made this his favorite place, took singular pleasure in bestowing charities and doing other good actions there, and in his familiar letters and private transactions, several copies whereof are still extant, he signed himself Louis of Poissy. His mother was Blanche, daughter to Alphonsus IX, or as some call him, the 8th King of Castile, the great conqueror, who in the battle of Murado defeated Mohammed Emir, called the Green, with an army of above 200,000 Moors. She was a princess of extraordinary beauty and prudence, was endued with zeal for religion and other virtues, and had great talents for government. Some have charged her with ambition and craft, but others call these accusations mere slanders, raised by her enemies during her regency. To her care and attention in the education of St. Louis we are indebted, under God, for the great example of his virtues. From his birth she would never suffer him to suck any other breast but her own, and gave all possible attention to every part of his education, and that of her other children. By her care he was perfectly master of the Latin tongue, learned to speak in public, and to write with elegance, grace, and dignity, and was instructed in the art of war, the wisest maxims of the government, and all the accomplishments of a king. He was a good historian, and often read the works of the fathers. It was his mother's first care to instill into his tender soul the highest esteem and awe for everything that regarded the divine worship, the strongest sentiments of religion and virtue, and a particular love of holy chastity. She used often to say to him when he was a child, "I love you, my dear son, with all the tenderness a mother is capable of, but I would infinitely rather see you fall down dead at my feet than that you should ever commit a mortal sin." The king frequently said to others that the strong impression which this important lesson made on his mind was never effaced during his whole life, and that no day passed in which it did not recur and excite him vigorously to arm himself afresh against all snares and dangers of surprise. He was placed very young on the throne. Louis VIII died on the 7th of November, 1226. Blanche, the queen mother, was declared regent for her son, who was then only 12 years old. To prevent seditions, she hastened the ceremony of his coronation, which was performed at Rheims on the first day of Advent by the Bishop of Soissons, the Archbishopric of Rheims being then vacant. The young king did not look upon this action as a mere ceremony, but prepared himself by the most fervent exercises of devotion, in order to move God to accompany the exterior unction which he then received with the invisible anointing of his grace, by which he might be made truly the anointed of the Lord. He considered the pomp of that day with fear and humility, saying to God in his heart with David, "To thee, O Lord, have I raised my soul, and in thee do I place my confidence." He trembled in taking the coronation oath, begging of God resolution, light, and strength to employ his authority according to his obligations, only for the divine honor, the defense of the Church, and the good of his people. Several of the greatest lords of the kingdom, thinking to lay hold of the opportunity of the king's minority, entered into a confederacy together and made many extravagant demands. None of these princes would be present at the coronation, and they appeared in arms soon after it was over. The chief were Philip, Count of Boulogne, a natural son of Philip Augustus, Peter of Dreux, a prince of the royal blood, who was also Count of Brittany, having married the daughter of Constantia, Countess of Brittany, after the death of Count Arthur, whom our King John is accused of having murdered. Hugh of Lusignan, Count of La Marche, who after the death of King John had married his widow, who had been Queen of England, and was therefore called the Countess Queen. But the most powerful of all these lords was Theobald, or Thibault, Count of Champagne, afterwards also King of Navarre. The Queen Regent put herself with her son at the head of his troops, and, finding means to bring over the Count of Champagne to his duty, struck the rest with such consternation that they all retired. They were soon after again in arms, and would have seized the king's person near Orleans, had not the Count of Champagne given the regent notice, and the whole country taken arms to escort him hastily to Paris. The whole time of the king's minority was disturbed by these rebels. But the regent, by several alliances and negotiations, and chiefly by her courage and diligence, by which she always prevented them in the field, continually dissipated their cabals. By her generals she pushed on the war against the Albigenses, and in the 3rd year of her regency obliged Raymond, Count of Toulouse and Duke of Narbonne, to receive her conditions. These were that he should marry his daughter Jane to Alphonsus, the king's brother, who should inherit the county of Toulouse, and that in case they should have no children by this marriage, that whole inheritance should revert to the crown, which accordingly happened. Henry III, King of England, had not taken advantage of these disturbances in France to recover what his father had lost in Aquitaine, which some attributed to his irresolution and to the counsels of his favorite Robert of Berg, or Berg. In 1230 he sailed into Brittany to succor the count, who was pressed by the regent, but he undertook nothing, and, being returned to London, in 1231 he concluded a truce between the two crowns for 3 years, and Peter, Count of Brittany, threw himself at the feet of King Louis with a rope about his neck, and obtained his pardon, engaging to serve 5 years in Palestine at his own expense. Louis rejoiced in his victories only because he saw he had procured by them the advantages of peace to his subjects. He was merciful even to rebels, and, by his readiness to receive any proposals of agreement, gave the most evident proofs that he neither sought revenge nor conquests by his arms. Never had any man a greater love for the church or a greater veneration for its ministers than this good king. Yet this was not blind, and he opposed the injustices of bishops when he saw them betrayed into any, and he listened not to their complaints till he had given a full hearing to the other party, as he showed in the violent contests of the bishops of Beauvais and Metz with the corporations of those cities. Pope Gregory IX, who had succeeded Honorius III, in the broils which the Emperor Frederick II had raised about the investitures of bishops, wrote to St. Louis that he had deprived Frederick of the empire, and had proposed Robert, the king's brother, in his place. But the king showed no other regard to those letters than to interest himself in procuring a reconciliation of the emperor to the Holy See. Gregory IX died in 1241, and Celestine IV, who succeeded him, filled the pontifical throne only 18 days. After him, Cardinal Fieschi, a Genoese, was elected under the name of Innocent IV, in whose time these struggles were the most dangerous, and with which St. Louis never interfered but to sue for peace. This good king never thought himself so happy as when he enjoyed the conversation of some priests or religious men of eminent sanctity, and he often invited such to his royal table. He appeared at the foot of the altars more humble and recollected than the most devout hermit, and he allotted several hours in the day to prayer. When some people said of him that he spent too much time in his usual devotions, he only answered that if he employed that time in hunting, tournaments, gaming, or plays, they would not take so exact an account of the time which he lost at them. He hardly allowed himself any time for diversion, and so great was his temperance and mortification that he had the art of practicing it with great austerity amidst the dainties of a royal table. Yet how much Christian severity soever he exercised upon himself, his virtue never made him morose. He was extremely humane and very agreeable in conversation. The inward peace of his mind and the joy with which his pure soul overflowed from the presence of the Holy Ghost enhanced the natural liveliness and cheerfulness of his temper. Coming from his closet or from the church, he in a moment appeared conversing upon business, or at the head of an army with the countenance of a hero fighting battles, enduring the greatest fatigues, and daring the most alarming dangers. He knew how to observe seasons, but with a decent liberty. Once when a certain friar had started a grave religious subject at table, he agreeably returned the discourse to another subject, saying, "All things have their time." His discourse at such times was cheerful, without levity or impertinence, and instructive, without stiffness or austerity. He celebrated feasts and rejoicings on the creation of nights and other such public occasions with great magnificence, some of which Joinville has given us a description of, but he banished from his court all diversions which are dangerous to morals. As for himself, he gave the greatest part of his time to the business of the state, and his devotion never in the least took of his care of the government. He was exact in holding councils, often gave both public and private audiences, and sometimes to people of the lowest rank, and was indefatigable in applying himself to the regulation of his army and kingdom. He was naturally bountiful. Nothing was more edifying than his sweetness, his moderation in dress and equipage, and the Christian humility in which he exercised himself more than in any other virtue, in which he practiced more particularly towards the poor, often serving them at table, washing their feet, and visiting them in the hospitals. Modesty, the most amiable of virtues, was not the least part of our saint's character. It was such in him that its awful sovereignty, which appeared in his very blushes, sufficed to check all loose thoughts in others. He was a lover of music and singing, but if anyone, in a song or otherwise, let slip the least indecent word before him, he was forever banished his presence. When it was expedient for the king to marry, the most virtuous lady was his choice. This was Margaret, the eldest daughter of Raymond Berenger, Count of Provence, of which sovereignty his ancestors had received the investiture from the emperors of Germany. They were descended from the Counts of Barcelona, who were a younger family of the royal house of Aragon. The Count's second daughter, Eleanor, was married to Henry III, King of England, his third, Sancerre, to his brother Richard, afterwards King of the Romans, and Beatrice, the fourth and youngest, to Charles, brother to St. Louis, to whom she brought for her dower the county of Provence. Margaret, the eldest, surpassed the rest in beauty, wit, and her extraordinary piety and virtue. St. Louis met her at Sens, where the marriage was celebrated on the 27th of May, 1234. God blessed it with a constant happy union of hearts, and an offspring which has given kings to France ever since. They imitated young Toby in their preparation for his state, and always observed continency in Lent, all other fast days, all festivals, and in other seasons prescribed by the ancient canons, which St. Charles Borromeo and the Roman Catechism order to be recommended, though by disuse they are not now esteemed as precepts, but counsels. King Louis, being before inured to government, took the reins into his hands in April 1236, having completed the 21st year of his age, but he continued to show the greatest deference to his mother, and still to govern by her counsels, which were always wise and virtuous. He had every day regular hours for reciting the divine office, and for his other devotions, in which he was constant and exact. He wore a haircloth, often used disciplines, and went to confession 2 or 3 times a week. The first monument of piety which he erected was the Abbey of Royaumont. His father had ordered in his will that the price of his jewels should be laid out in founding a monastery. St. Louis very much increased that sum, and made the foundation truly royal and magnificent. Out of devotion, he sometimes worked with his own hands in building the church. This was afterwards one of those places to which he frequently retired to breathe the air of holy solitude, and to attend to God with more perfect recollection of soul. He founded the Chartreux at Paris, to which he gave the Palace of Vauvert, and he built many other religious places and hospitals. Baldwin II, the Latin Emperor of Constantinople, in 1239 made St. Louis, in gratitude for his great largesses to the Christians in Palestine and other parts of the East, a present of the Holy Crown of Thorns, which was formerly kept in the imperial palace, but was then put in the hands of the Venetians as a pledge for a considerable loan of money borrowed of them, which the saint discharged. He sent 2 Dominican friars to bring this sacred treasure into France, and met it himself 5 leagues beyond Sens, attended with his whole court and a numerous clergy. He and his brother Robert, walking barefoot, carried it into that city, and after the same manner into Paris, in a most pompous and devout procession, all the streets being magnificently adorned. The king deposited it in the old chapel of St. Nicholas in his own palace in Paris, but gave some thorns of it to the church of Toledo, to that of the Franciscans at Cis, and to the abbey of St. Oly near Arras. The abbey of St. Denis was possessed of some before this time, as Rigord, the physician and historian of Philip Augustus, testifies in his reign. In 1241, St. Louis received from Constantinople, with other precious relics, a very large piece of the true cross, probably the same which St. Helen brought thither from Jerusalem. The year following he pulled down the chapel of St. Nicholas in his palace, and built on the same spot that which is now called, from these relics, the Holy Chapel. It is justly admired for the elegance, correctness, and sumptuous finishings of the architecture, and cost in building 40,000 livres, which according to the most probable estimation would amount at this time to the sum of 800,000 livres, says Father Fontenay, that is about 40,000 pounds sterling. Several ordinances of this good prince, still extant, are so many monuments which show us how much he applied himself to see justice well administered. It is his eulogium in his respect that in succeeding reigns, whenever complaints were raised among the people, the cry of those that were dissatisfied was only to demand that abuses should be reformed and justice impartially administered, as was done in the reign of St. Louis. In 1230 he, by severe laws, forbade all manner of usury, and restrained the Jews in particular from practicing it by many rigorous clauses. He afterwards compelled them to restore what they had exacted by the iniquitous oppression, and, where the creditors could not be found, to give such gains towards the holy war, which Gregory IX was endeavoring to set on foot. He published an ordinance commanding all who should be guilty of blasphemy to be marked upon the lips, some say upon the forehead, with a red-hot iron, and he caused this to be executed on a rich citizen of Paris, a person of great consideration, and to some of his courtiers who murmured at this severity. He said that he would rather undergo that punishment himself than omit anything that might put a stop to so horrible a crime, as William Nenanges tells us. Some moderns say he ordered the tongues of blasphemers to be bored through, but this is not mentioned by contemporary writers. This king set himself to protect vassals from the oppression of the lords, and took such effectual methods that they were delivered from the hardest part of their servitude. When Enguerrand de Soucy, one of the greatest lords in Flanders, had hanged 3 children for hunting rabbits in his woods, the king caused him to be imprisoned in the castle of Louvre, and to be tried, not by his peers as he demanded, but, as a flaw was found in his peerage, by the ordinary judges, who condemned him to death. He afterwards spared his life at the earnest suit of the peers of his realm, but subjected him to an amercement which deprived him of the greater part of his estates. This money the king ordered to be employed partly in building and endowing 2 chapels, in which mass should be said forever for the souls of the 3 children, partly in founding several hospitals and 2 Franciscans and Dominicans in Paris. During the minority of this good prince, the kingdom was entangled in many domestic broils, and distracted with intestine seditions, and wars in every part, insomuch that it seems a miracle of Providence that the queen, with all her prudence and diligence, should have been able to preserve the state entire, or that the king should be able afterwards to compose and settle it in the manner he did, reigning for some years with his sword always in his hand, yet almost without bloodshed. Frederick II, the impious and faithless emperor of Germany, though he often broke his engagements with St. Louis, as well as with other powers, could never provoke him to war. So dexterous was the saint in maintaining both his honor and his interests without it. Indeed, being exempt from those passions which usually blow the coals, he had an uncommon advantage in the pursuit of justice and a necessary defense, and whilst his magnanimity and foresight kept him always in readiness, his love of peace inclined him rather to sacrifice petty considerations than to see one drop of Christian blood spilt, if possible. He was extremely careful, in his engagements with other princes, never to be drawn into their quarrels, though he used all possible good offices to reconcile their differences. In his wars to reduce rebels, he caused the damages which innocent persons had received, even by his enemies' forces, to be diligently inquired into, and full restitution to be made for them. The Count of La Marche and Zaton, whose estates were a fief of Poitou, refused to pay homage to the Count of Poitiers, and the brother of St. Louis, through the instigation of his wife Isabel, the widow of the late King John, and mother of Henry III, then King of England, whom she called over to support his independency. The King of France marched against the Count of La Marche and took Fontenay, in which he made the governor, who was the Count of La Marche's son, prisoner, with 40 knights. Some advised the king to hang them as rebels, or at least the governor, but this counsel he rejected with horror, saying the son had been obliged to obey his father. He defeated King Henry III, who was never born to be a soldier, at Thalberg upon the Charente, and the city of Sens opened its gates to him in 1242. He again vanquished the Count of La Marche, who thereupon made his submission. Henry III fled to Bordeaux, and the next year returned to England, having made a truce with the French, for which he obliged himself to pay them 5,000 pounds sterling in 5 years. The councillors of St. Louis called it bad policy that he neglected that opportunity of conquering Guyenne and driving the English out of all France. But his views were very opposite, as appeared after his first crusade, when he concluded a peace with the English in 1258. On this occasion he yielded to England Limousin, Quercy, and Perigord, and the reversion of Haguenau and Zanton, King Henry III renouncing on his side all pretensions to Normandy, Anjou, Maine, Touraine, and Poitou. The French called the delicacy of their king's conscience a scrupulosity which was contrary to good policy. But, to satisfy them, he answered he did not doubt but King John had justly forfeited those dominions for refusing to clear himself of the charge brought against him for the murder of his nephew Arthur, Count of Brittany, but that he hoped by his cession to cement a lasting peace between the two nations, and that it was very honorable to his crown to have so great a king for vassal. At this time the barbarians raised great commotions in the east. A band of desperate Saracen ruffians in the mountains of Phoenicia obeyed on whose dignity was elective, and who was called the Ancient of the Mountain, or Prince of the Assassins. He had men among his banditti always ready to execute his orders in any part of the world, and to poison or stab whomsoever he should point out to them as obstructing the propagation of the Mahometan superstition. Hearing much of the power and zeal of St. Louis before he had taken the cross, he sent 2 resolute soldiers disguised into France with an order to assassinate the king. St. Louis, by the special providence of God, was advertised of this hellish design, and the assassins being apprehended, he courteously sent them home to their master. This visible protection of heaven was a new motive to make him redouble his piety and fervor. The great conqueror in Great and Little Tartary and the Indies, named Genghis Khan, or King of Kings, after he had vanquished the famous Tartar prince called Ung Chan, who is thought to have been the Nestorian king, who was surnamed Prester Yan, and was in priest's orders, formed an extravagant design of subduing the whole world to his empire. Some of his successors pursued the same, and in his view, Aktai, one of them, sent out 3 numberless swarms of Tartar forces, which spread desolation through Hungary, Poland, and Bohemia, and filled all Europe with dread and consternation. Queen Blanche and the whole French nation trembled. The king alone was undaunted, and said cheerfully to his mother, expressing the true motive of his confidence, "Madame, what have we to fear? If these barbarians come to us, we shall either be conquerors or shall die martyrs." By the resolution with which he spoke this, he calmed the alarms of his mother and of the whole state. Whilst he was preparing for his first crusade, he received a haughty letter from the Aktai, who styled himself the Immortal, pretended that his Tartars were the sons of men to whom the whole earth was promised, and required that he should deliver up his kingdom into his hands, and receive laws from him. But of this insolence the good king took no notice. Our saint afterwards sent persons into Great Tartary to inform him of the true situation of religion in those vast countries, and hearing that a daughter of Prester Yan was a zealous Christian, with some others, he entreated the Pope to confer episcopal orders on certain Dominican and Franciscan friars, and to send them with proper faculties into these parts, for which mission he furnished the expenses. But the progress of the arms of the Mahometans in the Holy Land was what chiefly drew the attention of this zealous king, and an extraordinary accident gave occasion to his undertaking in person a holy war for the relief of the Christians in those parts. In the year 1244, St. Louis was seized at Poitou with a violent dysentery of fever, which soon seemed to have brought him to the very brink of the grave. The grief and consternation into which this accident cast the whole kingdom, and the ardor with which all persons solicited heaven by their vows, tears, and alms-deeds for the life of their good king, are not to be expressed. The distemper still increasing, he fell into convulsions, and afterwards into a coma, in a kind of trance, in which he lay some days in such a condition that he was judged already dead, and his face would have been covered had not a lady prevented it, affirming she perceived him still to breathe a little. Then the piece of the true cross and other relics that had been sent him by the Emperor Baldwin were brought to his bedside and applied to his body. Soon after this he recovered from his insensibility, began to move his arms and legs, and spoke with some difficulty. By his first words he expressed his resolution to take the cross as the badge of enrolling himself to serve in the Holy War, and calling for William, the Bishop of Paris, who was present, he desired him to receive his vow for that expedition, and to put the badge of the cross on his shoulder. At this the 2 queens, his mother and wife, fell at his feet weeping, and the bishops of Paris and Maillot, by his bedside with others, conjured him that he would not entertain such a thought. But he was not by any means to be satisfied, and gave great signs of joy in receiving the cross, which the Bishop of Paris gave him with tears. The king continued still in a lingering state of health for some time, but in the beginning of the following year grew stronger than he had been before his illness. He then renewed his vow, and by letters assured the Christians in Palestine that he would make all possible haste to their assistance. But the preparation for such an expedition and the settling of his kingdom obliged him to defer his departure for 2 years and a half. At that time the king suffered a great loss by the death of William, the most learned, wise, and pious bishop of Paris, who governed that see from 1228 to 1245. In his writings, in a plain, intelligible style, he keeps close to what concerns morality, discipline, and piety, and does not run out upon metaphysical notions like many divines of his time. In 1245, Pope Innocent IV retired from Italy into Lyon, in France, which was at that time a free city, subject to its own archbishop, though held in fief of the emperor. This city seemed to him the most secure place, it being most remote from the arms of the Emperor Frederick II, from whom he had already suffered much and had everything to fear. Here he assembled that year the first General Council of Lyon, in which he summoned Frederick to appear, and upon his refusal accused him of having broken his word and his oath, of having arrested and imprisoned several bishops who were going to Rome to a council called by Gregory IX, of having obstructed the regular elections of pastors, robbed the churches, invaded their possessions and those of the Holy See, of having made a league with the Saracens, and made use of them in his armies against Christians. From these irregularities, and because he refused to make satisfaction, the Pope pronounced against him a sentence of excommunication and deposition. St. Louis, to whom strong application was made both by the Emperor and Pope, endeavored to reconcile them, and as he, with many others, disapproved of the step which the latter had taken, so he very much condemned Frederick's injustice and passionate behavior. He was better pleased with the measures taken by the Pope in this council for the Holy War, to which His Holiness allotted the 20th part of all the revenues of benefices for 3 years, and the 10th of the revenues of the Apostolic See and of the cardinals. 3 of the king's brothers took the cross to accompany him: Alphonsus, Count of Poitiers, Robert, Count of Artois, and Charles, Count of Anjou in Provence, as did also Peter, Count of Brittany, Hugh, Duke of Burgundy, William of Dampierre, Count of Flanders, Hugh of Lusignan, Count of La Marche, the Counts of Droyot, Bar, Soissons, Rethel, Verdun, Montfort, and a great number of other lords. The king declared his mother Blanche regent of the kingdom, but the queen consort would absolutely bear him company. The king went to the abbey of St. Denis to make the oriflamme, and set sail from Aigues-Mortes with his fleet on the 27th of August, 1248, towards Cyprus, where he had caused large magazines to be laid up. He arrived there in 3 weeks, and held a great council concerning the operations of the expedition. The Christians had still in Palestine and Syria 4 principalities, namely, that of Acre or Ptolemy, that of Tripoli, that of Tyre, and that of Antioch. Saladin had dismantled the city of Jerusalem, from which time it had fallen again some time into the hands of the Christians, whenever they happened to be stronger in the field. At that time the Khorasmins, the most fierce and warlike of all the Mahometan nations, were masters of it. They had been driven out of their own country, probably out of Khorasan, by an incursion of Tartars, and Saleh, Sultan of Egypt, taking 20,000 of them into his pay, promised them the plunder and lands they could win of the Christians in Palestine. In Egypt, Eladel had been succeeded by El-Kanul, and he by Melech Saleh, in whose reign St. Louis arrived in Cyprus. The Holy King passed the winter in that island, being honorably received by King Henry of Lusignan. He determined to attack the Sultan of Egypt, who at that time threatened to swallow up all Palestine. He therefore sent him from Cyprus a declaration of war unless he consented to restore the lands he had unjustly seized in Palestine. Saleh, who was sick with a sore in one of his legs, which threatened a mortification, wept as he read this letter, but sent back a haughty answer, and made all preparations possible for war. He employed spies to poison the victualling houses of the Christian army, but they were discovered and confessed the fact. William, the valiant Earl of Salisbury, surnamed Longsword, brought to St. Louis in Cyprus 200 gallant English knights. The Lord of Joinville, his historian, joined him there with a fresh reinforcement from France. The king's fleet consisted of 120 great vessels and 1,650 small ones, carrying on board 12,800 French, English, and Cypriot knights, and above 6,000 chosen soldiers. After having waited 8 months in Cyprus, the fleet put to sea on Trinity Sunday, and though a violent storm had dispersed several of the ships, they arrived in 4 days before Damietta, a strong fortress of Egypt, situated on an island formed by 2 of the mouths of the Nile, and built upon the eastern channel, on the shore opposite to the ruins of the ancient Pelusium. The Sultan had filled the Nile with his fleet, and lined the shore with a numerous army, appearing himself at their head. At the sight of the Saracens, St. Louis cried out, "Who am I but a wretched man, whose life belongs to God? He hath a sovereign right to dispose of it as it pleaseth him. Whether we are conquerors or martyrs, we shall glorify him either by the prosperity of our arms or by the sacrifice of our lives." The fear of a storm rising in a place where they had no port to shelter them determined the king to make a descent the next morning, which was Friday, though the vessels which had been dispersed were not yet come up. The next day the Sultan, finding his sickness much increased, had ordered himself to be carried to a house of pleasure a league above Damietta. The vessels in the center, in which was Joinville, were carried the swiftest, and the men landed safe. Then they covered themselves with their bucklers, and presented the point of their lances, which were in that age very long. Their Saracen horse came upon the gallop toward them, but durst not attempt to break the king of rampart which their lances formed. The left wing, commanded by the Count of Jaffe, and in the right, in which the king was, being all prosperously got on shore and in good order, the whole army marched towards the Saracens, who made a stand, but having lost the governor of Damiata and 2 emirs, took to their heels, and their fleet sailed up the Nile. The inhabitants and garrison of Damiata were in the utmost consternation upon a report that the Sultan was dead, and, setting fire to the place, fled. The French immediately took possession of that strong city and put out the fire. The king, full of pious and religious sentiments, made his entry, not with the pomp of a conqueror, but with the humility of a truly Christian prince, walking barefoot with the queen, the princes, his brothers, the king of Cyprus, and other great lords, preceded by the legate, the patriarch of Jerusalem, the bishops, and all the clergy of the camp. Returning humble thanks to God, they went in this manner to the principal mosque, which the legate purified and consecrated with the usual ceremonies of the church, dedicating it under the name of the Mother of God. The Sultan, though half dead, in his rage commanded 54 captains of the garrison to be hanged upon the spot, then was carried up the eastern channel of the Nile to Masur, or Mazur, a city which his father had built in the midway betwixt Damiata and Grand Cairo, and was followed by his army. The Nile begins to rise in May from the rains which fall in the torrid zone on the north side of the equator as the sun, which raises thick clouds under it, departs from that point of the zodiac. From the same cause, the flood of this river continues from June to the middle of September. This and the excessive heats obliged the Christian army to stay till the end of summer at Damiata. The king, to prevent as much as possible all plunders and injustices, took all care possible that such crimes should be strictly inquired into and punished, and that ample restitution should be made for any such that should happen to be committed. Not content to have given the severe charge to the officers, he appointed certain religious men in whom he could confide to watch over the officers and to receive all complaints. He forbade any infidel to be slain whom it was possible to make prisoner, and he took great care that all who desired to embrace the faith, as many did, moved by the pious example of this great king, should be perfectly instructed and baptized. But, notwithstanding all his watchfulness, whilst the army stayed about Damiata, many, to his extreme grief, gave themselves up to debauchery and outrageous acts of violence. In November, the king, leaving the queen and other princesses at Damiata with a strong garrison, set out with his army, intending to march to Grand Cairo, the capital. When he came to the place which separates the 2 arms of the Nile, near Masur, he stopped, the Mohammedan camp being on the other side of the river. In the meantime, the Sultan died on the 26th of November, 1249, leaving his son Almohaden very young, but he had appointed Fakhardin, who was the general of his army, and passed for the wisest and most valiant man in Egypt, regent of the kingdom, and his conduct justified the choice which his master had made of him. He constantly kept the Christians at bay, and often cut off their convoys at Damiata, and harassed all that stirred from their camp, in which he employed the Bedouins or Bedouins, a tribe of Arabs accustomed to live by plunder. The French were extremely perplexed how to pass this arm of the Nile called Thanis in sight of the enemy. To do it in boats or to throw any kind of bridges over they found equally impossible, unless they could first clear the opposite shore. They endeavored to fill up part of the channel by a new bank, but the Saracens widened it on the other side. They built several wooden towers to cover their workmen, but the Saracens destroyed them by throwing great stones upon them from 16 large machines, or burnt them by throwing gargouis, or Greek fire, which was a kind of wildfire made principally of naphtha, a bituminous liquid substance, easily inflammable and not to be extinguished. The Greeks are sometimes mentioned to have used this wildfire in war, and its effects were dreadful. The Saracens had learned it from the Greeks, and St. Louis never heard the horrible noise of it flying in the air, but, falling on the ground, he besought God to have pity on those who fought for the glory of his holy name. Things stood thus for near 3 months, when a Bedouin came to one of the French commanders, and offered for 500 besants of gold to show them a ford which might be passed on horseback. The price, though excessive, was readily paid him, and the ford was found, though a dangerous one, and false in one place where the horses were forced to swim. In the frequent skirmishes which had been fought, the French had always been victorious, and in them the Counts of Anjou and Poitiers had gained a great deal of reputation. On this occasion, the Count of Artois was, by repeated instances, obtained leave of the king to pass the ford at the head of the vanguard. The king, fearing his warmth would draw him into some rash attempt, was unwilling, and only consented upon his solemn promise not to do anything without his order. The army crossed the river on Shrove Tuesday in 1250. The vanguard easily repulsed a body of infidels, which disputed the passage, and the whole army got safe over, formed itself on the other side, and attacked the camp of the infidels, who were routed, and Fakardin himself, fighting like a desperado, was run through the body with a lance and killed. But the rashness of Robert, Count of Artois, overturned all these glorious advantages. Having driven before him a body of Saracens, he too eagerly pursued them with 2,000 men that were under his command, among whom were the Earl of Salisbury and the English knights. They entered Marsour, intermixed with the fugitives, and became at once masters of the town. This success might in some degree have atoned for the Count's rashness had he stopped there, as the Earl of Salisbury and others earnestly besought him, but he laughed at their prudence and pursued the enemy a great way beyond the town, till they grew too numerous and strong for him. They then drove him back into Marsour and besieged him in their turn in a house. He defended himself with incredible valor till, exhausted with fatigue and wounds, he fell upon a heap of infidels whom he had slain with his own hands. The great Earl of Salisbury and the 200 brave English knights were also cut off, and their loss was extremely regretted by St. Louis, though he said, "We ought to envy the glory and happiness of a death which he called equal to martyrdom." Being asked about the Count of Artois, he said, some tears beginning to run from his eyes, "He is in paradise. We ought to praise God for everything, and adore his profound judgments." The king had in the battle performed prodigies of valor and conduct. The Christian army, after having been twice victorious, was worsted in an engagement with Bondokdar, chiefly by his wildfire, which took hold of their clothes and the caparisons of the horses, and strangely disconcerted the soldiers, who had never seen it used in battles. After this combat, the Christians were almost all seized with a violent scurvy, which ate away their gums and jaws with incredible pain, and subjected them to terrible operations of surgeons. A grievous dysentery at length came on, and a bleeding of the nose was the symptoms of approaching death. Great numbers died, and the king himself was sick, and his body reduced to a mere skeleton, but yet he obliged his army to keep Lent. He led it over the ford to his old camp, repulsed the Saracens as often as they attacked him, and marched towards Damiata till he arrived at a little town called by Joinville Castle, by others Carmassage. Here the Christians, whilst they were treating with the Sultan, who still offered them advantageous conditions, by a mistake of some of their leaders, threw down their arms and surrendered themselves prisoners. The infidels massacred all the poorer sort that were sick or wounded, but by a certain drink cured in a couple days the prisoners that were persons of rank, though they were in the last stage of their fatal distemper, for only the Egyptians knew the remedy, which seems to have consisted in a decoction of certain herbs. Thus Joinville the historian and the king himself recovered their health by means of their captivity. The queen at Damiata, upon receiving this melancholy news, was brought to bed of her third son, who was named John, and from the sorrowful time of his birth was surnamed Tristan. The prisoners were conducted to Marsour, and the king was treated with respect. His conduct, resolution, and behavior filled the Mohammedans with admiration and astonishment. Under his sickness and misfortunes, he never let fall one impatient or angry word. As soon as he was taken, he desired to be attended by his 2 chaplains, with whom he recited the breviary every day with as much sedateness as if he had been in perfect health in his palace. He had the prayers of the Mass read to him every day, except the words of consecration, that he might the better join in spirit and desire with the Church in her daily sacrifice. In the midst of the insults that were sometimes offered him by those that guarded him, he preserved a certain air of majesty and authority which kept them in awe. When he was threatened with the most ignominious treatment and with the torture of the barnacles, a wooden engine by which every limb of the body was pressed and bruised, and the bones broken, he beheld the terrible machine without so much as changing color, and answered coolly that they were masters of his body and might do with it what they pleased. The Sultan sent to him a proposal by which he demanded 1,000,000 of besants of gold, and the city of Damiata for his ransom, and that of the other prisoners. He answered that the King of France ought not to redeem himself for money, but that he would give the city for his own releasement, and the millions of besants for that of all the other prisoners. The Sultan, charmed with his generosity and sincerity, said he had a noble soul, and sent him word that out of the esteem he had for him, he freely gave him his liberty, and remitted a 5th part of the sum demanded for the others. A truce was concluded for 10 years, in which the Christians of Palestine were comprehended. After this, the king and the principal lords of the army were put on board 4 vessels to go down the river toward Damiata, and to have an interview with the Sultan in the way. But all this was overturned by the murder of the Sultan Moadan. He had treated some emirs of the Mamelus with severity, and threatened to displace others among them when they should arrive at Damiata, and he was determined to set aside his mother-in-law, Saryardjor. Hereupon, a conspiracy was laid to take away his life in a public assembly of the emirs. Bundakdar first struck him on the hand with his sword. At this signal, other emirs rushed towards him, whilst the whole army stood looking idly on. Moadan fled to a neighboring tower, but it was set on fire. He then ran from one of his emirs to another, falling on his knees to entreat each of them, but everyone pushed him violently from him. He therefore cried out, "What, Mussulmans, is there not one man out of 100,000 that will defend me? I beg only my life. Let who will reign in Egypt." Several arrows were let fly at him, and he threw himself into the Nile, hoping to escape by swimming, but was stabbed in the water by 9 Mamelus. Oktai, one of the principal emirs and murderers of the Sultan, ran from this barbarous action to the tent in which King Louis was, and, showing him his dagger all bloody, told him he was now master of his person, and would kill him, unless he created him a knight, as the Emperor Frederick had made Fakhreddin. But the good king remembered how much that action had been condemned, and refused to do it, looking upon it that seeing an unbeliever is incapable of discharging the duties of the Christian knighthood, that honor could not be conferred on such a one. The barbarian was exceedingly moved by the king's modest courage, and his fury was converted into admiration. Some of the emirs even suggested that he would not be the most worthy person to be raised to the dignity of sultan, had he not been an enemy to their religion. They therefore set the crown on the head of the widow Saryardjor, and appointed a Mamelu surnamed the Turkoman to be her general and prime minister. The former treaty with the king was confirmed with a few alterations on the 4th of May. The infidels ratified it by various strong forms of oaths. Among those which they proposed to the king this was one, that he would be regarded to have denied God his baptism and the divine law, and to have spit and trampled upon the cross if he should ever violate the treaty. The good king was shocked at the recital of such an imprecation, and would by no means consent to repeat it, saying that it implied a blasphemy. The barbarians hereupon threatened to cut off his head, or to crucify him with all his people, and held the points of their swords to his throat. Yet he was inflexible, and they at length contented themselves with his oath in the usual form. The king was detained prisoner 32 days. At last, after having been perplexed with many cavils, treacheries, and alarms from the emirs, after having paid them a quarter of the ransom, and given his brother, the Earl of Poitiers, as a hostage till the payment of the rest, which was made in a few days, having moreover surrendered Damiata, which he had held 11 months, he was set at liberty. He embarked at Damiata with his 2 brothers, who were released upon the payment of the ransom, and the Counts of Flanders and Brittany, the Lord of Joinville, and the Marshal of France. The perfidious infidels, contrary to their treaty, confirmed by oath, murdered all the sick and wounded among the Christians in Damiata, and in many other things violated the articles of the agreement. Yet the king, when it was in his power, used no reprisals, and was most scrupulously faithful in fulfilling every point on his side, as he was in all his other treaties. Out of a desire of comforting the Christians in Palestine and of visiting the holy places, he sailed thither with the remains of his army, and in 6 days landed at Acre. In this voyage, hearing that his brother Charles was playing at tables upon deck, he went to him and threw the dice overboard into the sea. The tears and entreaties of the Christians in those parts, who saw themselves lost without resource if forsaken by the king in their present distress, moved him to stay some time among them. But he sent back his brothers Alphonsus and Charles into France to comfort his mother, and most of the French nobility went with him. In Palestine, the saint acted the part of a zealous missionary, strengthening many in their faith, and inspiring them with courage and resolution to suffer torments and death rather than to offend God. He often told them that as they lived on the ground on which Christ had so long conversed with men, had wrought all the wonderful mysteries of our redemption, their lives ought, in a particular manner, to be as much as possible the living copies of his holy conversation and spirit. The very sight of his devotion and piety was a moving sermon. 40 Saracens at Acre were by it converted to the faith all at once, and others in other places, and among these several emirs. He visited Nazareth fasting and on foot. Not only France but all Europe had expressed the greatest affliction upon the news of his captivity. The king, being in Palestine, wrote a circular letter to all his subjects in France, full of excellent maxims of zeal, piety, patience, and Christian prudence. He speaks of the death of the Count of Artois with the tenderness of a most affectionate brother, but expresses a holy joy that he was gone to take possession of the eternal recompense of martyrs. He discovers an entire but humble confidence in the divine mercy and in the intercession of the martyrs, gives due praise to the actions of others, is himself the only person of whom he says nothing. Not the least title savors of vain glory. Moaddan, the murdered sultan of Egypt, was the last of the race of Saladin who reigned in that country. Safareddin the Younger, surnamed Nazir, the sultan of Syria, was his cousin, and, to revenge his death, declared war against the Mamelukes in Egypt, and in the beginning of the year 1251 sent an embassy to St. Louis, offering to make him master of the whole kingdom of Jerusalem if he would join him against the Egyptians. St. Louis answered that he should be willing to treat with him if the emirs in Egypt continued to break the treaty which he had made with them. He sent John of Valence into Egypt, who spoke boldly to the emirs of the Mamelukes concerning their infractions of the treaty. The emirs promised to make amends and to give the king the most favorable conditions he could desire if he would not make a league with the sultan of Syria, and they released upon the spot 200 knights and other Christian prisoners whom they had detained. St. Louis took this opportunity to rebuild the walls of Caesarea, to fortify the port of Jaffa or Joppe, and to put other places of defense in the best condition he was able. In the meantime, Queen Blanche, being struck with a palsy in the 60th year of her age, put on the Cistercian habit and made her religious vows, having sent for the abbess of Mambusa to receive them. From that time she would only be laid on a bed of straw, and would suffer no rich ornaments in her chamber. She expired, lying on ashes, upon the 1st day of December in 1252. The king, when he received this melancholy news, burst into floods of tears, and, throwing himself on his knees at the foot of the altar in his chapel, addressed himself to God in these words: Lord, I thank thee for having preserved to me so long the best of mothers. I confess there was nothing among creatures on earth that I loved with equal affection and tenderness. Thou takest her away from me, and it is thy absolute will. May thy holy name forever be blessed for it. He showed his filial regard for her by having the sacrifice of the Mass offered for her soul in his presence every day of his life afterwards. He appointed his 2 brothers in France regents of the kingdom till he could arrive, and began to prepare for his departure, but was obliged to stay a year longer to finish the fortifications which he had begun. He visited Tyre, Sidon, and other places, and put them in a posture of defense. With his small army he put to flight the Mohammedans of Syria, and took from them in a wonderful manner the strong city of Naplosa, the ancient Samaria. Nothing could be more tender than the last adieus of the Christians of those parts, who, with abundance of tears, testified their sincere gratitude and called him their father. He embarked at Acre with the queen, his little children, officers, and troops, in 14 vessels on the 24th of April, 1254. St. Louis made each vessel of his fleet, especially his own ship, a kind of church. He obtained leave from the legate that the Blessed Eucharist should be carried in his vessel on a rich altar for the sick. Joinville relates that in their voyage at sea the king went to land at Lampedusa, a small uninhabited island lying betwixt Malta and Africa, and was strongly affected at the sight of a beautiful grove and garden with a cave or hermitage marked with crosses. They found there the bones of 2 hermits who had lately lived there. One of the company, those chose to stay behind, and succeeded the hermits in their anchoretical life. In the same voyage, a gentleman falling overboard invoked the intercession of the Mother of God, and was preserved, floating upon the waves, though he was not able to swim, till the king's ship, which was half a league behind, came up, and the company, finding him in that posture, took him in. Joinville, who was an eyewitness with all others on board the king's vessel, afterwards had this miracle painted in his chapel and in the windows of his church at Blécourt. The holy king seemed to be little affected with the universal joy which the people expressed for his return. He had always before his eyes the dangerous condition of the Christians in the East, and he wore the cross upon his clothes to show that he had not quitted his design of returning to their assistance. But his affliction, and the care of which he took more than ever to sanctify himself by austerities and other good works, did not at all take off the application he owed to the good of his realm. He, in the manner related above, secured its tranquillity by a firm peace with England and Spain, which there was always danger of a sudden rupture. In 1254, Henry III, King of England, visited the shrine of St. Edmund of Canterbury at Pontigny, and coming to Paris passed there 8 days with St. Louis. Interviews of kings usually produce quarrels which spring from jealousy, pride, and other passions, but here nothing reigned but harmony and piety. St. Louis told Henry that he esteemed himself infinitely more happy that God had given him patience in suffering than if he had conquered the world. Sometime after this, King Henry and his barons in England, having exhausted the realm by an obstinate civil war, agreed on both sides to make St. Louis their judge, and signed a compromise by which they engaged themselves to submit to his decision. So great was the universal opinion of his wisdom, equity, and uprightness. The King and Queen of England, Prince Edmund, and many bishops and lords of their party, and a great number of the Confederate barons on the other side, came to Amiens. St. Louis repaired thither also, and after both parties had pleaded a long time, he, by a definitive absolute sentence, annulled all the articles granted by the king to the barons in the Parliament or Assembly at Oxford, as being extorted by compulsion, and as innovations injurious to the royal majesty, but he confirmed to the barons their ancient privileges. St. Louis had no share in the transactions of his brother in Naples and Sicily, making it a rule never to interfere in the concerns of others, unless in works of religion or charity. But he never lost sight of the distressed Christians in the East, and the news of their calamities always made deep wounds in his heart. In 1262, Halon, a Mahometan Tartar commander in Syria, slew the last descendant of Saladin's brother, extinguished that Turkish branch, and made himself Sultan of Damascus. In Egypt, Bondokdar, general of the Mamelus, after having imbrued his hands in the blood of two sultans, in 1261 set the crown upon his own head. From this time the Mamelus reigned sultans in Egypt, though always elected out of their own bloody till. In 1517 the last was defeated by Selim I, emperor of the Turks, and after many insults publicly strangled at Grand Cairo. This Bondokdar was one of the most perfidious and cruel of men, and a most implacable enemy of the Christians. He spent the first 2 years of his reign in settling his government. He encouraged learning, though himself an illiterate barbarian, and he is said to be the first who established regular posts for correspondence, though the ancient Persian kings had royal messengers placed at proper distances to succeed one another and carry that king's dispatches with expedition to all parts of their empire. This tyrant in the year 1266, the fifth of his reign, resolved to extirpate the Christians in the east. He took and demolished Tripoli, Caesarea, Tyre, and other places in Syria and Palestine, and, without having any regard to his capitulations and oaths, massacred all the captives who refused to embrace the Mahometan superstition. These calamities awakened the compassion and zeal of St. Louis, and he again took the cross with great solemnity in a public assembly of princes and prelates at Paris on the 25th of March, 1267. But before he set out, he put the finishing hand to several pious establishments at home, among which we must reckon the house of Sorbonne. Robert Sorbonne, a canon and learned doctor at Paris, whom St. Louis honored with his particular friendship, and often made use of for his confessor, first began this community of masters of arts, who were the ablest students or professors in theology. The king was so pleased with the design that he founded this college in the most magnificent manner in 1252, and obtained the confirmation of it by Pope Clement IV. This house has long been the most renowned college in that university, and by raising the present magnificent building, Cardinal Richelieu has erected a monument to his own memory. St. Louis founded in Paris for poor blind men the hospital of Kinge-Vingt, so called because he placed in it at the first foundation 300 such patients. He likewise made provisions before his departure for the other poor, whom he maintained out of his private purse, for he had every day 120 indigent persons at a table near his own palace, and in Lent and Advent all who presented themselves, and these he often served in person. He kept lists of decayed gentlemen and distressed widows and young women whom he regularly relieved in every province of his dominions. The saint made his will, in which, having left legacies to almost all the great monasteries of his kingdom, he settled and regulated all the affairs of his own family and those of the state. He brought the kings of England and Navarre to an accommodation upon some differences that were between them relating to the city of Bayonne, for he always applied himself to do justice, to preserve peace in his own dominions, and to prevent war among his neighbors. Having one day stood godfather to a Jew who was baptized at St. Denis, he said with an affecting energy to the ambassador of the Mahometan king of Tunis that to see his master receive that sacrament he would consent with joy to pass the rest of his life in chains under the Saracens. To prepare himself for the crusade, he made 2 retreats at Maubuisson, Towards the expenses of that expedition, the Pope granted him the 10th penny of all ecclesiastical revenues, and he levied a capitation upon his subjects. He nominated to the regency of the kingdom during his absence Matthew, abbot of St. Denis, a man of quality, of the family of the Counts of Vendôme, and Simon of Clermont, Count of Nesle, both persons of known probity and singular prudence. The king's 3 eldest sons, Philip, John, Count of Nevers, and Peter, Count of Alencon, took the cross to accompany him, as did also Theobald, King of Navarre, Robert, Count of Artois, son to whom, who was killed at Massor, Guy, Count of Flanders, and many other lords. The king embarked with his army at Aigues-Mortes upon the 1st of July, 1270, and when the fleet was over against Cagliari in Sardinia, a great council was held, in which it was resolved to attack Tunis. The French fleet accordingly proceeded towards Africa, and entered the Gulf of Tunis, at the head of which that city stands upon a lake which communicates with it. The Saracens who lined the shore immediately fled, and the descent being made without opposition, the French encamped upon an isthmus which separates the Gulf of Tunis from another little gulf. They attacked the castle of Carthage, seated 15 miles from Tunis, and carried it sword in hand. Tunis, Tripoli, Algiers, and many other principalities were re-erected in Barbary in the 11th age, for till then that country had been subject to the Sultan of Egypt. Mulli Mastanza was at that time king of Tunis, and he prepared to make a vigorous defense, but his troops only showed themselves, and after light skirmishes retired. The French waited for the arrival of the king of Sicily with his fleet to lay siege to Tunis, and his delay was the cause of all their misfortunes. For the heats being excessive in those burning sands, the camp was soon filled with malignant fevers and other epidemical diseases, which were contagious like a pestilence. The king's beloved son, John Tristan, Count of Nevers, a prince of admirable innocence and sanctity, was the first person of distinction that was attacked. He was born at Damietta in Egypt, and was in the 21st year of his age when he died in Africa of dysentery and fever. On the very day of his death, in the beginning of August, the king himself and his eldest son Philip were seized with the same disorder. The king's delicate constitution and weak emaciated body made the distemper more dangerous to him. He continued, however, for some days to act and to give all necessary orders, and particularly to treat with the ambassadors of the Greek emperor, Michael Pelagius, about the reunion of the church with the Latins. And by his pathetic exhortations he made both these ambassadors afterwards zealous advocates for the union. The principal person was Veccus, chancellor of the Church of Constantinople, afterwards patriarch. When the fever and weakness confined him to his bed, he still caused his chaplains to come to his bedside, and he recited with them the whole church office as long as he was able. He had a great cross set near him, so that he could easily turn his eyes upon it. He communicated very often during his illness, which held him 21 days. Finding his distemper increase, he called for his eldest son, Philip, and gave him certain pious instructions, which he had drawn up in writing before he left Paris. 2 copies hereof are still kept in the Chamber of Accounts at Paris, under this title, Instructions of King Louis the Saint to Philip his eldest son. The dying admonitions of this great king to him are here inserted in abstract. My son, before all things I recommend to you that you love God. Be always ready rather to suffer all manner of torments than to commit any mortal sin. When sickness or any other affliction befalls you, return thanks to God for it, and bear it courageously, being persuaded that you deserve to suffer much more for having served God ill, and that such tribulations will be your gain. In prosperity give thanks to God with humility, and fear lest by pride you abuse God's benefits, and so offend him by those very means by which you ought particularly to improve yourself in his service. Confess your sins frequently, and choose a wise and pious ghostly father who will teach you what to follow and what to shun. Let him be one that will boldly reprehend you and make you understand the grievousness of your faults. Hear the divine office devoutly, meditate affectionately what you ask of God with your mouth. Do this with more than ordinary application during the holy sacrifice of the Mass, especially after the consecration. Be bountiful, compassionate, and courteous to the poor, and relieve and favor them as much as you can. If anything trouble your mind, reveal it to your ghostly father, or to some other grave and discreet person, for by the comfort you will receive, you will bear it more patiently. Love to converse with pious persons. Never admit any among your familiar friends, but such as are virtuous and of good reputation. Shun and banish from you the vicious. Make it your delight to hear profitable sermons and discourses of piety. Endeavor to gain the benefit of indulgences and to get the prayers of others. Love all good and abhor all evil. Wherever you are, never suffer anyone to detract or say anything sinful in your presence. Punish all who speak ill of God or his saints. Give often thanks to God for all his benefits. In the administration of justice, be upright and severe. Hear patiently the complaints of the poor. And in all controversies where your interests are concerned, stand for your adversary against yourself till the truth be certainly found out. Whatever you find not to belong to you, restore it without delay to the owner, if the case be clear. If doubtful, appoint prudent men to examine diligently into it. Endeavor to procure peace and justice to all your subjects. Protect the clergy and religious who pray for you and your kingdom. Follow the maxims of my grandfather, King Philip, that it is sometimes better to dissemble certain things in ecclesiastics than to repress them with too great violence and scandal. Love and honor the queen your mother, and follow her counsels. Make no war, especially against Christians, without great cause and good advice. If necessity force you to it, let it be carried on without damage to those who are not in fault, and spare the innocent subjects of your enemy as much as possible. Use all your authority to hinder wars among your vassals. Be scrupulous in the choice of good judges and magistrates. Have always a great respect for the Roman Church and the Pope, and honor him as your spiritual father. Hinder, to the utmost of your power, all blasphemies, rash oaths, games of chance, drunkenness, and impurity. Never make any extravagant expenses, and never lay on your subjects any heavy or unjust burdens. After my death, take care to have a great many masses and prayers said for me in all churches and religious communities in France, and give me a share in all the good works which you shall do. I give you my blessing with the most tender affection that any father can give to a son, and I pray our Lord Jesus Christ to protect and strengthen you in his service, and always to increase his grace in you, that you never do anything against his holy will, and that he may be ever faithfully honored and served by you. I beg the same grace for myself, that we may together see, laud, and honor him for all eternity. The Holy King gave other instructions to his daughter, the Queen of Navarre. Having settled his affairs and acquitted himself of his duties to others, he desired that no more mention should be made to him of temporal concerns, and applied himself wholly to think only of that great affair which was to be decided betwixt himself and God alone. He scarce spoke any more to anyone but to his confessor. He praised and thanked God for having placed him in his present situation. He prayed with many tears that he would enlighten and show mercy to infidels and sinners, and that his army might be conducted back into their own country without falling into the hands of the enemy, that none of them might be tempted through weakness to deny Christ. His charity, zeal, compunction, humility, and perfect resignation increased in his last moments, and in the fervent exercise of these virtues he prepared his soul to go forth and meet his Judge, the Redeemer. On the 24th of August, which was Sunday, he received first extreme unction, according to the discipline of that age, and afterwards the viaticum. It was his custom, whilst in health, and as long as he was able in his sickness, to creep on his knees from his place in the church up to the altar when he went to communion. He was then too weak to do this, but he would needs get up, and he received the Blessed Sacrament kneeling by his bedside. He again that day called for the Greek ambassadors, and renewed in a most pathetic manner his exhortations to union with the Roman Church. He continued the rest of this time in ardent prayer, especially in acts of the divine love and praise. He lost his speech the next day from 9 till 12 o'clock. Then, recovering it again, and lifting his eyes towards heaven, he repeated aloud those words of the psalmist, "Lord, I will enter into thine house. I will adore in the holy temple, and will give glory to thy name." He spoke again at 3 in the afternoon, but only said, into thy hands I commend my soul. Immediately after which he breathed his last in his camp on the 25th of August, in the year of Christ, 1270, being 55 years and 4 months old, and having reigned 43 years, 9 months, and 18 days. Many miracles wrought by the intercession of St. Louis were juridically approved, and he was canonized by Boniface VIII in 1279, in the reign of his grandson, Philip the Fair, by whose order one of his ribs was placed in the cathedral at Paris, and his head in the Holy Chapel in 1305.